Welcome to Philosophy 2005. This is the honors section of Critical Thinking. Today's reading is Education After Auschwitz by Theodor Adorno. I want to start by reading the opening paragraph on page 1. So here goes. The premier demand upon all education is that Auschwitz never happen again. Not happen again. Its priority before any other requirement is such that I believe I need not and should not justify it. Do I have to explain to you why it should not happen again? He's wondering rhetorically, and the answer, of course, is no. I cannot understand why it has been given so little concern until now. To justify it would be monstrous in the face, and so just to be clear, right, this is decades before there are sort of, this is delivered at a time in the mid to late 60s when there have not been the kind of memorials and museums to the Holocaust that maybe we're more familiar with today. Not that there were no memorials or no recognition of what had happened, it's just it was not nearly what it has become today, and he was very worried, right, about the fact that there simply wasn't much of a registering, a recognition, a public acknowledgement of the scale of this monstrosity. So to justify it, to justify, right, this concern, to justify it, to justify this concern that Auschwitz not happen again, to justify it, to have to sit here and argue for why this is important, he's saying, would be monstrous in the face of the monstrosity that took place. In other words, the facts here speak for themselves. The piles of bodies. Look at some pictures, as I did when I was a young man, at the bodies, at the prisoners. These images speak for themselves. Yet the fact that one is so barely conscious of this demand, never again Auschwitz, and the questions it raises shows that the monstrosity has not penetrated people's minds deeply, itself a symptom of the continuing potential for its recurrence as far as people's conscious and unconscious as far as people's conscious minds and their unconscious psyches are concerned. In other words, what he's worried about here is the fact that people have not spent much time thinking about this problem. Auschwitz happened, the concentration camps happened. He thinks is an indication that there's the very real danger, a very real danger, that it will happen again in some form. Doesn't have to happen again in exactly the way it happened, right? It's not so much that he's worried necessarily that, for instance, the Nazi Party will come to power again in Germany. That's not his concern here. Specifically, it's that barbarities like Auschwitz may happen on any given day around the world, in the world in which we live, and that's his worry here. Now, every debate, he says, about the ideals of education is trivial, and boy, are they. They're nothing if not trivial in the United States, he would say, these days, when we think about it in the framework he's giving us here, right? Every debate about the ideals of education, for instance, is it preparing you for a sort of lucrative career or not? So all these kinds of debates about what education is supposed to be about and what people are supposed to be getting out of it, etc., is trivial, he's saying, and inconsequential compared to this single ideal, never again Auschwitz. To be clear, then, what he's arguing here is something like, if we are not making this a focus of our early childhood education, but also our educational system in general, that catastrophes like Auschwitz not ever happen again, we are being immensely trivially things and inconsequential. We are sort of worrying about minor issues, and we're sort of not paying attention to the looming catastrophe staring us in the face. So he says, one speaks of the threat of a relapse into barbarism. This is the one speaks right now. Man spricht here in German. There's almost an impersonal sense here, right? People talk about the threat of a relapse into barbarism. People worry about this, right? Man's inhumanity to man. And his point here is this is not a threat. This worry about a relapse into barbarism, it's already happened. Auschwitz was this relapse, and not merely Auschwitz, right? Every concentration camp, perhaps the United States, dropping of nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and boy, go down to the bottom of page 1, you'll see the Armenian genocide referenced here, right? I mean, here it is decades and decades ago in the 60s. Adorno's referencing the fact that the Turks were responsible for an attempted genocide on the Armenians here, right? Murdered well over 1 million Armenians. This is something that even just a few months ago, prior to this COVID-19 crisis, if I'm not mistaken, the leader of Turkey, Erdogan, was complaining to Donald Trump, our president, about the United States Congress apparently offering some kind of condemnation of this very event on the bottom of page 1. So you can see that, a century later, this is still a sore, touchy subject for Turkey, and particularly the nationalist government that is currently in power there. And they would still like to deny that this happened, to deflect from it. And so, I mean, it's nothing, it's incredible, right, that we're reading a text here. It's 50 years old or something, more than 50 years old. It's referencing something that was actually in the news just a few months ago. And if anything, what the news was testifying to was something that is very much in line with what Adorno's arguing here, right? People want to pretend like these kinds of things never happened, sweep them under the rug. The danger then is they will happen again. They will happen again when people least expect it or are not prepared for it, and then we'll be those poor fools that are living through the repetition of historical events because we have been too ignorant to try to understand our own history. Those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it. That's essentially the thought I was trying to get at there. Okay, so let's continue through this first paragraph. Every debate about the ideals of education is trivial and inconsequential compared to this single ideal. Never again Auschwitz. It was the barbarism that all education strives against. What are we doing in educational systems if we are not, at the very least, educating people so that they do not become people who commit these kinds of atrocities? Mass murder, for instance. Can we at least set the bar that low? That as a result of the instruction you receive in the K-12 system and into the university system, can we at least hope that whether or not you go on to do wonderful work and get paid well, can we at least hope you will not go on to murder a bunch of people, right? I mean, if nothing else, this is what Adorno's getting at, huh? What are we doing here with what we call education? If we are not at least, intervening and intervening into people's lives in such a way that they become less likely to be these kind of murderous, monstrous psychopaths, we have to really ask ourselves what the heck we're doing if we're not able to at least do something to stop this, to hinder it, to slow it down, to prevent it, ultimately. So, Auschwitz was this relapse into barbarism, and barbarism continues as long as the fundamental conditions, and that's what he's going to be talking about in the rest of the remainder of this essay. Barbarism continues as long as the fundamental conditions that favored that relapse continue largely unchanged. And that is his thesis, right? The fundamental conditions that favored a relapse into barbarism continue largely unchanged. We still live in the kind of world that will produce these kinds of atrocities. Why? Well, the societal pressure still bears down, for one thing. And what he's talking about there is something that hopefully is a little bit familiar to you from our reading of Freud and the watching of Happiness Machines, part 1 of The Century of the Self. The societal pressure still bears down, although the danger remains invisible nowadays. It drives people toward the unspeakable, which culminated on a world historical scale in Auschwitz. And Auschwitz is just a symbol for Adorno. Don't get hung up on the fact. It is a specific concentration camp, and perhaps the worst. I'm not sure that we need to rank them. But Auschwitz here is a symbol for him of these kinds of mass atrocities. Among the insights of Freud that truly extend into culture and sociology, one of the most profound, seems to me, to be that civilization itself produces anti-civilization and increasingly reinforces it. And then he mentions several writings here. If barbarism itself is inscribed within the principle of civilization, then there is something desperate in the attempt to rise up against it. And that is what he is going to go on then to want to talk about, right? Barbarism itself is inscribed within the principle of civilization. It is, and has been with us all along. Now, there is something desperate then in the attempt to rise up against it. It's almost as though we're already infected with barbarism, you could say. um, and yet we're looking for a cure. Okay, so let's continue then, and from this point forward, I'll kind of run through our study guide. I'll use that to sort of orient. What I'm going to do today, I'm not going to go through this entire essay. It's simply too much to bite off in one sitting. But what I can do is I'll use the study guide now to orient the reading of just the first few pages and to sort of set the framework then for the rest of what he's doing. So at the very least, at the end of this process, you should be in a position to then go through the rest and have a framework for understanding exactly what he's up to. All right, so using the study guide then, we'll begin with another quote by Adorno. Here in Education After Auschwitz, Theodor Adorno argues that, quote, attempts to work against the repetition of Auschwitz are necessarily restricted to the subjective dimension, people's individual psychology, you might say, and social psychology as well, but psychology really is what he's getting at here. Psychology, sociology, these domains. All right, so he says, attempts to work against the repetition of Auschwitz are necessarily restricted to the subjective dimension, right? By this, I also mean essentially the psychology of people who do such things. In a nutshell, that's what he's talking about here. What is it that makes people do such things? What is it, and what's going on in their heads? I mean, to put it as crudely as possible. I do not believe it would help much to appeal to eternal values. So in other words, we're not going to sort of talk about humanity and consider this as sort of man's inhumanity to man, and just attempt to sort of mobilize shame to sort of shame people out of this kind of behavior. He thinks this is not going to work, right? Simply talk about how shameful such actions are, how shameful such atrocities are. I do not believe it would be much help, he says, at which the very people who are prone to commit such atrocities would shrug their shoulders, right? Language of eternal values. Right? And often, be kind of the end to justify the means, whatever it is they're thinking, right? I also do not believe that enlightenment about the positive qualities possessed by persecuted minorities would be of much use. So here's another thought, right? Well, maybe the reason for this kind of racism and the violence that kind of exploded and erupted out of it would be to sort of humanize these other people, in this case, Jewish people in Germany, and to sort of educate the German public about how wonderful Jewish people are, their contributions to culture and whatnot, right? This, to Adorno, is a subtle kind of blaming the victim move that he thinks is just focusing attention in the wrong place. It is not the persecuted minorities that are the problem here. The roots, as he puts it, the roots for these kinds of acts of mass violence, the roots must be sought in the persecutors, not in the victims who are murdered under the paltriest of pretenses. Pardon the interruption. So as Adorno was describing it here, right, the roots for these acts of mass violence must be sought in the persecutors, not in the victims who are murdered under the paltriest of pretenses. Right, and what he's getting at here is even the people carrying out the violence against these victims don't always necessarily believe in their own mission, right? They do it anyways because that's what the bosses told them to do. Those were your orders. I don't make the rules around here, etc. This kind of rationale. What is necessary is what I once in this respect called the turn to the subject. One must come to know the mechanisms that render people capable of such deeds, must reveal these mechanisms to them, and strive by awakening general awareness of those mechanisms to prevent people from becoming so again. This is essentially the Freudian therapeutic model on a massive scale, right? By becoming aware of what has been done to us and what we then do to ourselves and others, we become capable of overcoming mechanisms, essentially, that are implanted in us. Socialization and domination and violence that is perpetrated on us as young children by adults, often under the rubric of discipline, guidance, and just socialization in general. It is not the victims, Adorno claims, who are guilty, and clearly, in this case, we know that to be true. It's not the victims who are guilty, not even in the sophistic and caricatured sense in which still today many like to construe it. Boy, I don't even want to think. I mean, what he's getting at here is anti-Semitism, both in this in 1960s Germany, even today, right? It still exists, and so you'll still find people, right? Like these idiots who were there marching in Charlottesville a year or two ago. I mean, just execrable human beings that fully deserve, right, to be outed on social media and held responsible for their absolutely atrocious behavior. But the idiots, I'm thinking, who were caught on film saying Jews will not replace us, right? I mean, there, for example, would be an instance of what he's talking about, right? People still blaming victims, still blaming, for instance, Jews, anti-Semitic, I don't even know what to call these people. Mental casualties, people whose brains are mush and who have been indoctrinated on the sort of darkest and seediest corners of the internet and in the sort of bunkers out in rural Americana where a bunch of people who look like they should be extras on the Duck Dynasty TV show get together and kind of promote virulent racism in just in a swamp-like condition of ignorance, right, where they essentially have no contact with anybody that doesn't look much like them. Anyways, it is not the victims. I mean, I get upset, I get animated here because there's just nothing more disgusting to me on the face of the earth, frankly, than this kind of a human being. Not the victims who are guilty. Only those who unreflectingly vented their hate and aggression upon them are guilty. Right? So another way to think of this is those who are engaged in sort of a public manifestation of hate and aggression that is rooted in a lack of what he's calling reflection here, historical ignorance, conspiracy theories, just illiteracy in general, and certainly scientific illiteracy, etc. Those who lack self-reflection and who vent their hate and aggression. These are the guilty parties. Then, whether we're talking about early 30s in Germany, mid 30s in Germany, whether we're talking about in the 60s in Germany as this resurfaces all the way to the present day, certainly Germany is having itself an eruption of, again, virulent racism and a demonization of outsiders, although the outsider today that seems to be demonized in Germany is now the Turkish minority there, as opposed to the as opposed to its Jewish population. So the victims might change. What doesn't change, in a sense, are these guilty ignoramuses, right? Venting their hate and aggression. And we're certainly seeing plenty of hate and aggression still being vented today, and often joined again with this inability to reflect, or this lack of cultivating reflection, thoughtfulness, carefulness in what you're thinking, carefulness in your understanding of what is causing what, and sort of what the problems that we're faced with are, right? And in a nutshell, the stupidity of this class of hateful idiots consists in constantly seeking some minority group to demonize, to stigmatize, and to scapegoat. I mean, it's just, the scapegoats might change, the specific minority population might change. What doesn't change is this dynamic, though, right? And this is sadly one of the connecting threads from Adorno's essay that connects, what's happening in countries like ours today all the way back to Nazi Germany, frankly. So the only education that has any sense at all is an education toward critical self-reflection. I can't help but laugh there because, in a sense, right, it's exactly that kind of an education that is incredibly difficult to obtain these days too, and not by accident, right? Think, for instance, of how in your university trajectory here you go, right? Philosophy 2005, critical thinking. Like, there you go. Apparently this is where you're supposed to develop this ability to engage in self-reflection. You know, if our educational system took this seriously, it would not simply be one class you take to satisfy a requirement, but would form a sort of core part of what you're doing with education, right? And to put it mildly, it would not involve memorizing facts and then regurgitating them. Okay, so over the course of his essay, Adorno discusses a number of psychological mechanisms that made Auschwitz possible in Germany, and which he also believes still present a clear and present danger of regression into barbarism. I mean, clear and present danger. I don't know how else to express the relevance of this document for the present day. The problem Adorno is posing, we can formulate this problem in a number of ways, and perhaps reformulating would help, right? To talk about, you know, what are the subjective conditions that promote the possibility of a relapse into barbarism? Maybe that doesn't work so well for you, right? And to reformulate it then, we could put his question like this. How do we ensure that mass atrocities, such as the Holocaust, never happen again? And, you know, honestly, Auschwitz and the Holocaust I think can be misleading here. How can we ensure that mass atrocities such as the Parkland school shooting, or that shooting that took place in Las Vegas where the guy was on the top of the hotel and killed a number of people at a country music concert, how do we make sure that those kind of mass atrocities never happen again? Right? For instance. So, you know, you can think about it in those terms as well, right? When you walk into a classroom these days, you see a little sign by the entrance that, you know, gives you instructions for what to do in the case of an active shooter. So this is clearly not how we ensure that mass atrocities never happen again. In fact, this seems to be almost a normalization of it, right? This is just like a fire drill or something like that. Here's another way to formulate this question. What are the factors that allow for a nation or a people to become complicit in mass atrocity? Another way to put it, why do people who otherwise seem normal prove capable of behaving in the most irrational and monstrous ways imaginable? I mean, if you've ever learned something about a serial killer or two, one thing you'll notice in the stories told about serial killers is, you know, this person might have been a father and a husband, and then was committing serial murders or rapes or something like this on the side. And often a really difficult thing for people to do in the aftermath, whether it's neighbors, obviously the family is going to be traumatized, but neighbors, even friends, acquaintances, co-workers, etc., will often ask themselves, well, the person seemed completely normal in my interactions, and I can't even believe that they would be doing this, right? It's like I didn't even know them. Well, this is the kind of problem he's trying to focus in on, is how is it that people who might seem like decent people in some settings or contexts prove capable of behaving like monsters? And finally, here's another way to formulate Adorno's question here. What are the points of connection between fascism as it arose in Germany and Italy in the 1920s? So what are the points of connection between that kind of old fascism and life in so-called liberal democracies or in Soviet communism? So the Frankfurt School here that Adorno's a member of is tracing points of connection, you might say, between European fascism and what passes for, you know, kind of free society in the United States, but also for its communist alternative at this time in the Soviet Union. And, you know, in a nutshell, basically, they're saying so-called liberal democracies such as the United States or post-World War II Germany and the Soviet Union at this time both have much more in common with European fascism than they would like to admit, and are essentially birds of a feather with this European fascism. So Adorno is going to go on then to distinguish objective and subjective conditions for the relapse into barbarism. We're going to just go ahead and talk about the objective conditions briefly here, segue into subjective conditions, and then we're going to end. So he distinguishes between objective and subjective conditions for the relapse into barbarism. Objective conditions include aggressive nationalism and the atomic bomb. Today we could add the climate crisis to that list. And in the U.S., for instance, mass shootings. However, Adorno goes on to argue that, quote, since the possibility of changing the objective conditions is extremely limited today. So why is he saying that? I ask you this, right? Let's consider that with mass shootings, right? The possibility of changing our national laws as pertains to guns. I don't know that it's extremely limited today, but there are serious constraints, as we've seen, right? After these shootings, there are often attempts to reform laws and regulations that meet with effective resistance. And so it almost feels like even the politicians in Washington are powerless, right? I'm thinking about the optics around the discussion about gun violence after Parkland, where it wasn't even clear if the president, Donald Trump, was in a position where he could do something to change our gun laws, or whether a lobby like the NRA wasn't actually the real power broker here. That is, when the president met with the NRA after Parkland, it wasn't clear who exactly was in a position of power there over the other. So this might, what this then means is, there are going to be these objective conditions, aggressive nationalism, a lot of nationalists around the world, boy, in his time or in ours. We can think of Hungary, Turkey, the Philippines, and elsewhere around the world, where you have aggressive nationalist parties moving against perceived enemies on their borders and within their own lands as well. Also the atomic bomb, nuclear weapons. So how we put it today, we could have the climate crisis, right? So he says, it's not that it's impossible to change these things, it's just to change them would require, a lot of people around the world working together. And if there's one thing we cannot count on, it's just that, isn't it? If nothing else, right? This present virus pandemic we're in should show us that, right? Global cooperation is not really very strong these days. So, Adorno is then going to argue, well, since the possibility of changing these objective conditions is limited, attempts to work against the repetition of Auschwitz are necessarily restricted to what he calls the subjective dimension. It's on page 2. So, subjective conditions then, what does he mean by this? Well, it's the psychology, just as we said, right? The psychology of people who do such things. For example, right, what is the psychology of a person who commits mass atrocities? Or who is complicit, that is, who watches it happen, for instance, and doesn't intervene and helps cover it up or something like this. If we can understand the psychology of such people better, we can presumably intervene to prevent such acts from occurring, right? And we can better identify those who would tend to commit such acts, hopefully, intervening in advance, preventing it from happening. We can also just understand in a general sense what leads to these kind of barbaric eruptions and act to, counteract, right? We can organize a kind of counteracting force against this. So as you read over the remainder of Adorno's essay, I want you to see if you can identify the numerous subjective conditions that make it likely that barbarism, that is, violence on a mass scale, will once more erupt in supposedly liberal democracies. So in closing then on the study guide, I'm not going to do this now, but I go through the very, maybe the very first subjective condition, right, which is the feeling of sort of being suffocated by surveillance and by administration and assessment, essentially, right? You are always being monitored. There's nowhere you can go where you have anything like real privacy. Everybody is constantly judging you, something like that. This exerts a psychological pressure on human beings, right? According to Freud, this is essentially the bargain we enter into in civilization, right? We're going to defer our desire for gratification. We're going to defer that repeatedly and constantly in order to, coexist harmoniously with others, but we pay a price for this, right? We constantly suppress our desires, we deny ourselves what we want as we would like to have it, and instead find ways to make our actions socially palatable, and then we end up, right, building up a sort of reserve of hostility and aggression that can then manifest itself even in a tendency to destroy ourselves, to destroy others wantonly, to just feeling like you are trapped and suffocating. I mean, geez, do I even have to explain this under present conditions, right? If nothing else, right? People feel locked away in quarantine and experiencing much more isolation than we're accustomed to, I think would tend to feel this even more powerfully, right? That in a sense, right, we've never been more regulated and more controlled than we are now, to the point where we can't even go outside without sort of fearing what others might do to us, perhaps, simply for doing what we want. I want to go for a walk and enjoy the sunshine. Whoops, did I forget my face mask? Is the police officer going to give me a ticket for not being out for acceptable reasons? It's all this kind of psychological, these thought processes where we're imagining what others are thinking about us, and that kind of stuff. That all just builds up, essentially, right? And can then manifest itself in acts of aggression, right? And so this is the first subjective condition he talks about, right? Is essentially the discontent that civilization necessarily produces in us as a byproduct, you might say. Okay, we are out of time for today. I think that's more than sufficient for the first part of this essay. So that'll be it for today with Education After Auschwitz by Theodor Adorno. Thank you for joining me.